Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. Our thought today is going to come from Genesis chapter 45 and a little bit out of chapter 50. Time would fail for us to describe all of Joseph's life. Sometimes we talk about it we describe it as a roller coaster of a life. And it really, there was ups and downs all through his life. But one thing that was constant was the fact that Joseph maintained his trust in Jehovah and in Jehovah's plan. And we see that really kind of come out in the dialogue that he has with his brothers. Here in Genesis chapter 45 and in verse 1, this is when Joseph finally reveals himself. Remember, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. They told Jacob that he had been killed, and so Jacob was heartbroken. Keep in mind there was a little bit of favoritism being shown there by Joseph or by Jacob to Joseph and Benjamin. But then Joseph, he went through a period of ups and downs. He was sold out of slavery into Potiphar's house, and there was a good situation there. And then eventually, because of Potiphar's wife, he ends up kind of uh, in an unfortunate situation and ends up being blamed for something he didn't do. And so then he's put in prison, and then he ends up being able to tell the Pharaoh what Pharaoh's dreams meant. And there was a whole lot in between all of that. But finally, he's the quote-unquote governor over Egypt. In fact, he is basically lord over Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. And it seems as though some of the information we get here in these final chapters of Genesis, we find that the relationship between Joseph and the Pharaoh is a very, very good one. Joseph trusts him just implicitly. There is just this complete trust and care that the Pharaoh has for both Joseph and for Joseph's family as well. We see that from the Pharaoh. Here in chapter 45 and in verse 1, Joseph finally reveals himself as being Joseph to his brothers. It says he could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, so he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. It must have been a very emotional situation. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers couldn't answer him because they were dismayed in his presence. Whether or not they were dismayed, you read this and you think, oh, well, oh no, it's Joseph. I don't know that they fully understood that it was Joseph, because notice in verse 4, "Please come near me." So they came near, and he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." It's almost as if they didn't believe him, or they didn't fully comprehend, or it just didn't quite kind of sink in that this is really Joseph. So he had to emphasize, he had to say it again, so that they would understand. And in verse 5, "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Now, as I mentioned, Joseph's life was one that was constantly up and down. There were sorrows and there were joys associated with it. But one thing you never see Joseph is question God. When he is sold into slavery, he doesn't say, "God, why did you let me get sold into slavery? Why am I here? Why did you put me here?" When he's in prison, you don't see Joseph blaming God or saying, "God, why I've been faithful to you. Why would you let me be thrown into prison?" You never see that from Joseph. Here in verse 5, as he's, and again, whether they're dismayed in his presence because they actually did get it and they were like, "Oh no, is this really Joseph?" Joseph has to re-emphasize it, but then there does seem to be some suggestion that they're, please, no, this can't be Joseph. But Joseph has to emphasize that, yes, it's me. And then in verse 5, when he says, "God sent me before you to preserve life." And obviously, Joseph, the whole situation with the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, Egypt has been able to build up a great supply of food to be able to take care of its people. And people were coming from regions all around because there was a huge famine in the whole region. And for 7 years, after the 7 years of plenty, there was going to be great famine. And it's only year 2 of that famine. Verse 6, "For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Joseph knows his position, this isn't something where he has kind of got kind of full of himself and look at what I've accomplished and look at what I've been able to make for myself and the life I have and the power I have. Joseph puts it all on God. And Joseph says, God has sent me before you. God is the one who's given me this opportunity to provide this deliverance. And then in verse 8, he says, so now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, a lord over all, a lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Now, he's not saying that his brothers didn't do wrong by doing what they did by selling him into slavery. Okay, he's not saying that. But keep in mind, it also wasn't his brothers who sent him to Egypt. Okay, they sold him into slavery after that. They had nothing to do with anything after that. Everything else was the situation. As each situation came, one thing led to another. But this is how we talk about God's providence. We talk about God's providence in a way that it just so happened that this came about. And then it just so happened the timing was such that this then happened, or this person said this, and this person overheard this, who then went and told this person. And God's providence is one of those things you can never put your finger on. You can never say, here's a miraculous event that created these things that took place. Providence doesn't work miraculously in the sense of how we define a miracle. The Bible defines a miracle as an observable suspension of natural law. That's not to say that God's power doesn't suspend natural law or can't suspend natural law even today. It's that we don't observe it anymore. We're not able to. I don't believe God allows us to see that observable suspension of natural law. Therefore, while it may be the express power of God, and God is still utilizing his power in events to bring about his will, the observable miraculous element of it's not being observed by us. That being said, we see God's providence without miracles throughout the Old Testament. One case study of God's providence, and it's a beautiful case study, is the book of Esther. I mean, just almost every single chapter, it was, and about that time, so-and-so entered, and about this time, so-and-so overheard this, and about this time, and it's like, well, God's working there somewhere. How did all that happen in such a way that it all happened to work out in just the right way? I think it's summed up by Mordecai's statement to Esther. Perhaps this is why you've come to the kingdom at this time. Maybe this is why, and even though Mordecai doesn't say this, but maybe this is why God has allowed you to be in this position as queen so that you can deliver the Jews at this time. He doesn't say that outright. He uses that phrase, perhaps this is why. Because who are we to assign purpose necessarily to exactly what God's will is or providence? But Joseph acknowledges here that I'm in this position. God granted me the ability to understand the 7 years of plenty and famine, and here we are. And now I can spare you. I can spare my family. And that's why in verse 8 he says, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Yeah, his brother sold him into slavery, but in the end, God used that event. His plan was already in effect, and through God's providence, however God manifests that, he brought this about where he would end up years and years later at the right hand of Pharaoh. And so it is that purpose that God's will involved Joseph being at the right hand of Pharaoh that Joseph's referencing here in verse 8. So then in verse 9, and he goes on, he says, go, I want you to bring up my father, bring all the people and so forth. And then he falls on Benjamin's neck and he weeps, and Benjamin weeps on his neck. He kissed his brothers and weeps over them. We see in verse 16, Pharaoh hears about Joseph's brothers are here, and Pharaoh says to Joseph, okay, hey, we're going to give them the best Egypt has to offer. We're going to take care of your family. You tell them to go home, bring your father, bring everybody, and we're going to take care of them. We're going to give them a specific place to live. Don't be concerned about your goods. The best of all the land of Egypt is yours, Pharaoh tells him. And so that's exactly what ends up happening. But then in chapter 50, this is after Israel, Jacob, after he has died. He's passed away at the end of chapter 49. So Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. He commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So they did. Uh, Joseph had made an oath, had made a vow to his father before he died that he would go and bury him back in the plot that Abram had acquired to for his family to be buried. And so Joseph, he requested the permission to do that by Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, "Yep, you go up, you bury your father just as he made you swear to do." So he did it. Then in verse 15, Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him." Notice they understand what they did. What they did was wrong, and they know that. And so, but now they're worried that Joseph's going to, seek retribution. While Jacob was alive, Joseph was fine towards us. Maybe he didn't want Dad to see how he's going to treat his brothers. But now that Dad's gone, he might seek retribution, seek vengeance on us for what we did. So in verse 16, they sent messengers to Joseph saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph.'" Now, whether or not Jacob actually said this, it's debatable. I don't know. I'm not accusing them of lying. Maybe he did say this. He says, "I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, "Behold, we are your servants." Again, the text doesn't specifically say that Jacob did or didn't have this instruction to be said about them. It's possible Jacob did. I tend to think, and most of the commentaries tend to think, that they made this up. But even still, I don't think, even without it, obviously, the way Joseph's heart was, Joseph wasn't going to do anything regardless. But having said that, verse 18, his brothers went down. "Behold, we're your servants." Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" Which is an interesting statement for Joseph to say. I think Joseph's referring to enacting punishment against them. Even though technically from an authoritative perspective, Joseph was in a position to seek vengeance in the sense of in the physical, in the flesh. He could have, he was in authority. He was second to Pharaoh. If he wanted to put his brothers to death, he could have done it. If he wanted to, whatever he had wanted to do, he could have done it. But I think that's the point regarding, especially that term vengeance. What does God say throughout the Bible? "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay." And again, it's not that Joseph's seeking vengeance or that he wants retribution in any way. His point, though, is that I'm not in God's place. God is the one who makes that determination to punish. God makes the determination to seek retribution, to seek vengeance. I am not in the position of Jehovah. And I think that's a really interesting statement that he makes, that he separates his role as Pharaoh's right hand from God's role over all creation and the one who ultimately all judgment rests with God. So in verse 20, Joseph says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Now, this is kind of verse 20. We had kind of allusions to it before in chapter 45 regarding the providence of God and Joseph's trust in that providence. But here, this is almost like his Mordecai's statement. Mordecai, perhaps this is the reason why you're in the position you are, Esther. Well, here's Joseph's version of that. You meant this as evil against me, but God meant it for good. And this is throughout, and the only thing that really, I say the only thing, that what gives this statement and all of these allusions to God's plan such weight and such power and conviction is the consistent example of Joseph in his life of trusting the Lord, trusting that God was with him. And even when evil came about, even when bad things happened to Joseph, Joseph didn't blame God. He didn't go, "God, I've been such a faithful servant. Why are you letting this happen to me?" He even questioned the wisdom of God, which is the one thing Job did do. As we'll note at the end of the book of Job, Job recognizes, he never cursed God. He never questioned God in terms of God's ability or right. He questioned God's wisdom. Joseph never even questioned God's wisdom. We never see anything like that from Joseph. What we see is this reliance and trust in him. And so in verse 21, now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. But then, as if that's not enough, to show the complete trust and faith and conviction that Joseph had in the providence of God, notice how that in verse 24, when Joseph's dying, he's lived to about 110 years, it says, Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, this goes all the way back to the promises of God when circumcision was first instituted by Jehovah as a sign of the covenant between him and Abram, it was at the time that God gave the promise and the covenant of circumcision that God changed Abram's name to Abraham, that we see this conviction from Joseph, knowing that the Hebrews cannot stay in Egypt. They will not remain in Egypt forever. However long it's going to be, and we know it was a couple hundred years, it will not be forever. Why? Because God made a promise to our father Abraham, which would have been Joseph's, great grandfather. Jacob is his dad, Isaac is his great grandfather. Abraham would have been his great grandfather. He knew about that promise. He knew and trusted that Jehovah was going to bring that about. So one day, the Lord is going to visit you, it says, through some means, through some providence, through some power of Jehovah. God is going to take this family of people, the Hebrews, and he is going to lead them to that land, the promised land, the land of Canaan, the land of promise. And he trusted so much in that he forced Israel, or well, he didn't force them, but he took an oath from Israel. He made Israel promise him. That means all of the family together, that when this happens, this means it had to be passed on from generation to generation. Okay, this was a vow that would carry on through the generations up until Moses, that when this does happen, you will, as I did to my father, to Jacob, we took his bones back to the place where he wanted to be buried. You will take my bones and carry my bones up from here to Canaan. And so that's exactly what they did, as we will see eventually. But what's interesting and so wonderful about this is, and again, was there any dialogue or revelation from God to Joseph in any of those events when he was in prison, aside from what we have record of? We don't know. But what's amazing about this, and for instance, like when he was in prison at one point, Jesus came and spoke to Paul. Whether or not that happened a lot or not, we're not given a record, but we know it happened at least once. Well, Joseph has complete conviction. He has complete faith that God's going to bring this about. And I say all that to say this, is when we're in life, there are going to be joys. We're going to have things that happen that are going to be happy things, and things that are enjoyable and fun and wonderful. But life is also full of sorrow. Life has downs. There's times in life when we're depressed, times when we feel like we're just kind of floundering around life, and times when we feel like we're just kind of barely treading water. But even in the best of times, we should never forget that Jehovah should be thanked for what we have, for the joys of the day. And then in the worst of times, God should never be forgotten, or blamed for one thing, but never be forgotten that God continues to take care of us. There are still blessings for which we can always be thankful. And then finally, that we trust that there's a reason why these things happen. We may never know why. And that's one of the great lessons of Job, is that we're never told Job was informed as to why all of this ever happened in the first place. In fact, to me, that makes the point even more poignant, is the fact that Joseph didn't need to know. He finally learned, he finally figured out at the end of the book of Job, I don't need to know why this has happened. God doesn't need to explain to me his wisdom. He doesn't need to explain to me his plan. I have to trust that God knows what he's doing. And God has shown time and time again, first of all, he does. And not once has that faith been misplaced by people who've trusted in God. Not once has that faith been misplaced. And for us, we don't know the full picture. We don't know some of the little things that just so happen, little words that could be said that you don't know a person may need to hear, that will uplift them and edify them. Maybe you're just talking, and the next thing you know, this, or maybe you don't ever know, but this person maybe really is affected by something you do or something you say. Just little events that may take place that have repercussions for years to come, either for good or for bad. Trusting that Jehovah knows what he's doing is the key component of our life. It's the only way we can have peace in this world, knowing full well that it all goes back to the promises of God, that God keeps his promises. And just as through Jesus, Jesus says, be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. Well, we can overcome the world through the Lord, through our trust in him and our knowledge that it doesn't matter what happens in this world. What matters is how we deal with it. And football coaches say this all the time. Life is 90%, or it's 10% what happens to you, and 90% of how you deal with it. And I think there's a great, wonderful spiritual application to that, is that, 10% of life are the things that happen, good or bad. 90% of life, what really matters is how are you going to handle those things? And from that spiritual perspective is, where is our trust going to be? How convicted are we going to be in believing and trusting that God has a purpose, has a plan, has a reason for the things that happen or for the things that don't happen, as the case may be? And whether it's in our personal lives or maybe it's in the political realm, not to say that God is usurping diplomacy or not diplomacy, usurping the democratic votes or anything like that, elections. But God utilizes the choice of people to still bring about his will. And it doesn't matter who's president, it doesn't matter who's in Congress, it doesn't matter who's in charge. God's still going to bring about what he wants to happen. It doesn't matter what wars are being fought or what terrible things are happening around our world. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. I mean, it does from the physical perspective and how it's going to affect us in the short term and sometimes long term. But in the end, we have to trust that Jehovah knows what he's doing. And we have to trust that we will one day, no matter what happens, receive a reward from Jehovah if we're faithful to him. All right, that's the devotion for you today. Lord willing, our next devotion will be tomorrow at 6:30. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.